Welcome to the HR Huddle. I'm Eloise Shelton of Vanilla Recruitment. We specialise in recruiting HR, marketing, office, accountancy roles. So today we're joined by Alice Bromwich of Peony and Magnolia HR to discuss domestic abuse and provide an overview of the support channels and practical advice and guidance on how we can help our employees. So today's session will last approximately an hour. If you have questions as the session is running, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll get through as many as we can. Or obviously you can unmute yourself and ask Alice at any time if it's particularly relevant. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you very much. Before I start sharing my slides, thank you for coming today. What I would like to do is actually have people's contribution to things. So if you're comfortable, I'm happy for you to sort of be on screen, off screen, however you feel. But yeah, there will be points where I will be asking you to either put something into comments or just really asking opinions on things. So yeah, I will get on with the presentation. Start sharing. Okay, can everybody see the screen all okay, just to confirm? Yeah, lovely. Okay, so I will go through and give myself a bit of an introduction to begin with. So my name's Alice Bromwich. I have a HR consultancy called Peony and Magnolia. I set it up in 2019. Prior to that, I have been in-house HR for majority of my career. I sort of worked out quite early on that that's what I wanted to do. So I, many moons ago, did my degree in HR and business. 10 years later, decided I'd sort of crack on with the masters and the CIPD route. And so when I sort of call myself sometimes a HR geek, it's because I'm really kind of passionate about working in this area. And I think that comes from sort of my values. I can get on a soapbox quite often and talk about fairness and equity. And I've put a quote in there that somebody said to me, I seem to have an authentic tenacity to ensure fairness. And I think that that's true. So it's around sort of, as we know in HR, it's listening to people, being sometimes in the middle between employees, employers, and having to sort of be the voice of reason. So for me, it's working around and with other people that inspire me. Through my consultancy model, I've set up like a partnership model, which for myself works because it means that I work with companies like leadership companies that are encouraging coaching female execs. I look at social mobility, so mentoring and social mobility, so increasing in the creative arts, also ESG businesses. So the passions that I have, I want to be able to bring into my business to then support others. One of the things I did last year was become a trustee for the domestic abuse charity. They were actually in their 20th year and they were awarded a QABS award, which is the Queen's contribution to voluntary services. This is a small charity in comparison to some of the other female, larger women's refuge, etc. But has had a big impact, particularly in Hertfordshire, but is also sort of seeping into sort of the surrounding counties as well. One of the reasons I became a member of EDA, or IDA, however you want to say, is that when I first set my consultancy up, I approached a couple of lawyers that I know and said, I really feel that we should have a policy around domestic abuse. I think this is an important subject. And their response was, not really an employment law matter, which was a bit disheartening. But that didn't really stop me. So then I found EDA, and that's exactly what they've done. So I probably joined them as a membership in early 2020. A lot of their networking was then online, which made it more accessible, and that has just grown and grown. So I would definitely recommend becoming a member. It's free membership, but the information and the knowledge within that group is really vast. At the end of last year, I produced a podcast called Playing with Hire, and one of the episodes aligned with 16 Days of Activism. And that is a UN strategy where we talk around violence against women and girls. And so episode 2 of that podcast is me talking around domestic abuse in the workplace. And actually, if you're interested, expands on some of the conversations that will start today. And finally, because I decided that I needed to create more platforms for my voice to be heard, about 2 years ago, I decided to start a collaboration project. That is called Espresso, and it's like a HRE magazine. It goes out to business owners, founders, HR community, and again, it's around talking around topics that others don't talk about or shy away from. Naturally, I have included domestic abuse in that agenda, as well as other conversations around inclusion and neurodiversity. So yes, that's where I talk about things and what I do. One thing, before I hang on, I'll just go back. One thing before I move on is that the reason I talk about this is that I come from this from a survivor point of view. And when I say that, it's around when we talk about life events and we talk about lived in experiences, I share with people because I find that it helps people open up, and around the conversation that I was myself in a domestic abusive relationship for 12 years. I've now been out for almost 5. And that's why I now really feel that we should talk about this subject and we should raise awareness. Because in that time, I was a HR professional. In that time, I worked for multiple different companies and this information wasn't there. The first time I actually the terminology was put to me was when I was making a police statement. So I don't want people to get to that point where we're at crisis point. I would really like to start raising the awareness in the workplaces so people can start maybe understanding a bit earlier on. One of the things I want to cover today is very briefly is around us and our role in the workplace as HR professionals. We want to look at duty of care and the laws surrounding it. There is was a very large change in the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021. Some of that may not have translated down into the areas of work that you're working in now. I've pulled out just some of it that would be related into the workplace. And again, I want to look at the tangible tools and supports, and that's where I'd really like some discussion, if possible, around that. Does anyone have any questions before I get into the nitty-gritty of it? Nope. Okay. So I'm going to ask you all to wake up and say, first of all, what is people's understanding really of domestic abuse? Happy for you to put it in the comments, or to just, we're a very small group, so just say out anything that you feel that may be relevant.
I know I think probably my view of it is probably quite small. When I think of domestic abuse, it's what you would, I would think it would be physical abuse.
Yep.
Rather than anything else. But I know Wendy has said physical, mental or emotional abuse from another person.
Thank you. I can't actually see the comments. That's
helpful. And other people have added or from another person or from an employee. So physical, emotional, sexual, financial, control.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really useful, because actually our image, and this is why this is one of the topics why people shy away from, is the stigma or the judgment about domestic abuse. So obviously, we've all grown up with the likes of EastEnders, the bashing of it's not that. And it's really important actually that point came up, because domestic abuse is the abuse of one person on another, but the domestic part of it needs to be a personal connection. So again, this is defined under the Act. So that personal connection can be a family member, can be obviously a relationship, it can be if you've got children with somebody. So it has to have a personal connection. But as we talk through, yes, psychological, emotional, the physical side, the sexual side, the verbal, and the economic. Now, the reason why they're broken down in these ways is because when we talk about each of the different types of abuse under these areas, when we look at that, we suddenly in HR can potentially see how these are already linking into some of the things that we do at work. So we have bullying policies in place. So if we think about verbal abuse, what do we talk about in the workplace already? If we talk about economic abuse or support, again, we should have equal pay policies. We should have benchmarking. We should have an understanding of how we have a fairness in the workplace. So some of these topics aren't completely away from what we do already within our sort of professional being. Does anybody know how many people are impacted or affected by domestic abuse, or what the costs might be to our economy?
No, but I imagine it's probably much higher than we think it is.
Yeah. So 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men suffer from domestic abuse in their lifetime. So I've already come on here and said, I'm somebody who's been impacted. The likelihood is that you have worked with people, or you are working with people who have been impacted or are being impacted. Some may have an awareness of that, some may not. They may have brothers, sisters that are being impacted by it. So the spread and the ripple of this actually goes out, is much higher, is much, much higher. I often say, when we look at this stat as well, that also means that the perpetrators of the abuse are equally working within your business. And it's important for me to say that, because we all have worked with people or toxic people where we think that behavior is XYZ. It might not meet the borderline, or it might be, but we all know people who are behaving in the way that is abusive, creates a toxic environment. So it's very difficult in understanding that we will have perpetrators in our workforce as well as victims. When we talk about the costs, so when I talk around the costs, that the costs to the government.
Somebody has actually made a suggestion of costs. So Elaine has suggested 2 billion.
2 billion. So 2 billion is a cost which, yes, has been talked around, and that's around the cost within the workplace. So that is a cost which they say hits the workplace every year. As a society, as the government have said that it's potentially up to £74 billion. Now, if we take into account workplace, if we take into account courts and police and social services and all the other support channels, this has also increased. So if you look at that from 2017, which really isn't that far ago, that's also increased by a substantial amount. Now, with all stats, I say take things with a pinch of salt, that there is an element that there will be more reporting. There's higher awareness. We've had a pandemic. We've had all the other things around it. So the cost is going to be increasing. I have got some stats which are relevant. Again, when you look at the government stats and ONS, there's always a bit of a delay, and there has been a delay in reporting. But out of those areas of domestic abuse, which ones do you think are or have been reported most to the police? Do you think it might be emotional, verbal, sexual?
I think it's physical a lot of the time. Yeah.
I'd say the physical and the sexual, I think, is probably the one that people would go to the police with. So
that's really interesting, because nearly 85% of victims who came and made a police report were experiencing non-physical abuse.
Oh, okay.
So this is where this act has changed and has recognised coercive control, and has recognised the non-physical side much more, which is where the reporting has started to increase. Now, there doesn't need to be many repeated acts for it to be non-physical, and I'll go in and explain what that is in a bit more detail. 13% sexual assaults. These were March figures, and nearly 21% stalking. Now, the reason I wanted to include those ones in particular was, again, if we think about the sexual and the stalking, we've already got policies in our workplace that protect people. The stalking in particular is quite important, because workplaces are often targets of stalking, whilst in a relationship and post-separation as well. One of the things that I just want to sort of touch on before I move on is that the overall agenda of changing the Domestic Abuse Act is, there are lots, and it's about bringing agencies together and bringing a lot more things together. for us as HR professionals and working or within the workplace, if we concentrate on the promoting awareness side of things, and also the holding people to account. So again, we're very good at keeping records if it's what we do. If we can keep records of situations that might be happening or how we've supported particular employees, that evidence can be taken forward then for them to do something with. So again, it's supporting people through that period of time. Okay, we'll just move on. So I've got a few more stats, and the reason I want to linger on the stats is for a couple of reasons. I think is my screen jiggering your end? Yeah. Hopefully it will stop. It keeps doing it, but I apologise for that. Yeah, a few more stats before we sort of move on, just to really bring home sort of the cost element of things. So 2.4 million adults experienced domestic abuse in the last year. So in a 12-month period, that is what's been reported. That nudges up every year on year, but that's when we're talking about millions of adults a year experiencing it. And like I say, this is increasing. So over that period of time, that's increased by over 7%. I won't go through all of these stats, you can see them yourself, but I think one of the things that I think is really important is to consider that perpetrators of abuse do not discriminate. And I mean that in the sense this will impact everybody and every level of society. The stigma and the judgments of, and it's what happens, we've created an environment, you know, it's a lower class abuse, it's something that happens to the lower classes, it's those uneducated, or it's certain races or certain cultures, it's the image that's been built up and the judgment around it. And actually when we were receiving the award at the charity, it was presented on behalf of somebody from the royal family, and he made a really good point. He said until he started understanding, he had no idea that it impacted every level of society. He said, you know, again, his image, and he was quite open in saying, I had a judgment of who this impacted, and actually what goes on behind closed doors used to be, we'll keep it behind closed doors, don't bring it out, let's not talk about that in public. And he was then saying, actually, by working with the charity, he started to really understand the impact that this is having across all areas of society. So that's when we talk around inclusion, just to keep that in your mind as well, about how you might bring this conversation in, depending on your workplace, because every environment is different, really. And the two other facts that I guess I wanted just to sort of put on here were that, like I said at the beginning, somebody may be in a situation at the moment, they may be beginning to have an awareness of what it is, they may have left that relationship. The post-abuse actually increases, and this is where it takes a long time sometimes for that to peter out, if it ever does, but the recovery, they're saying, takes between 2 to 10 years. And also then when we go back to the fact that if we're taking into account those in domestic abuse relationships and post separation, that 75% of those victims are targeted within the workplace environment. So does anyone have any sort of input or questions around that at all, or comments? Nope. Okay, I will move on.
It's quite scary, Alice, the you know, the enormity of it all. Yeah.
And I think personally, we haven't spoken about this early enough. I think we've all felt a bit uncomfortable about talking about it, and something that makes us feel comfortable, we put down way down the agenda of things. So yeah, I think it is definitely time to talk around it a bit more.
Absolutely.
So again, some contribution from yourselves would be great, really, on this side. So I often bang on about duty of care in the workplace. So I'm sure we've all been in a situation where people have said, well, you're HR, you're on the side of the manager, or, you know, you only take whatever they want to do. You don't stick up for us employees. I mean, it's constant conversation. And actually, I always go back to say, well, my role is to have a duty of care towards the employees. My role is to be governed by laws that are in place. Obviously, we resort to the Employment Rights Act and the Employment Law Act much more in our everyday roles. But I wanted to ask really if there were any of those legislations that I've listed already that you adhere to, or you, I don't know, it resonates more with you at all within the roles you do.
Whilst people are thinking about that, Alice, I've got a question from Caroline. Yep. She's asked, how does the duty of care, and when is it appropriate to raise concerns with next of kin, etc.? So just wondering when GDPR comes in.
Yeah.
Sorry, someone just. I just wonder when GDPR comes in, or if we should have a plan such as we do with mental health.
Yeah, and we'll come on to that. So I will remind me again when we come on to talking around the framework around it.
Okay.
But it's a good point, because again, this is very much about consent, isn't it? People are coming and potentially talking to you about a situation or seeking support, as they would with any life event or well-being issue. So it's about how you respond, really. So yeah, I will come on to that slightly later. Are there any other thoughts around the legislations that govern potentially more in your roles or your markets or industries?
No.
Okay, so the thing that I often equate to is if I used to work in construction and rail industry, which I absolutely loved, and it was highly audited and highly, the health and safety element governed a lot of what we did. And I would always sort of equate this to the fact that if the guys were working out on site, they would have had a health and safety brief, they would have had they'd be out in their PPE, there would be people on site whose roles were around safety. You wouldn't let somebody go up onto scaffolding without the right equipment.
Mm-hmm.
If something happened in that environment, the consequence is, well, either a near miss, and those near misses were reported, and we would look at a risk register, and we'd look at changes in behaviour and etc. and education piece. But if something was to happen that was particularly major, then the Corporate Manslaughter Act is a very real thing that we would consider. That was the, on a risk register, that's not where we want to be going. And again, in the rail industry, if any incident happened on track, it may not have been even involving our guys, it was something that was briefed out to the whole of the industry as a safety element. So I refer to that as an example, because when we then think about our people in the workplace and the health and safety in the workplace, either in a physical environment or working from home, and I go back to the stat around stalking. So if you have somebody who at the time hasn't come to you, but when they do come and say, look, I've got a situation, I've got an ex-boyfriend who's stalking me, when does this hit your health and safety radar? When does this hit your risk register? What steps do you put into place to prevent any further stalking within the workplace or within the work environment? How do we protect that person from having their emails monitored if they're working from home, for example? How do we protect in a health and safety point of view? Because ultimately, if that person is attacked and is killed by their perpetrator, the Corporate Manslaughter Act would still come into place if that person has come to you and raised concerns and that behaviour is happening within the workplace. And I know that sounds quite serious, but that's why I want to equate it to something that is more common practice now. We all talk about health and safety in the workplace, but have we really thought and extended that into this subject? Does anyone have any thoughts on that before I kind of go on to asking you some more questions? No, okay. So really, it's questions around for you to maybe reflect on. Do you keep a risk register yourself in HR in your roles? No. The kind of thing that you would have put on the risk? Do you know what you would put on a risk register if you did?
Yeah, Caroline said yes, they keep HR risks.
Okay.
Does anybody know what they would have on their risk register? People can unmute themselves and just chat if they want to.
I'll say for mine, because we do have our HR risks. I'll tend to put them as to different headings. So it could be legal risk, corporate risk, personal risk, pension risk, etc., and we'll code it that way.
Okay. Do you have anything on your risk register that's related to employee welfare under domestic abuse at all at the moment?
We wouldn't necessarily categorically spell it out directly as that, but we would possibly put that as a personal risk, but then would say what steps we've taken, what the implications are, and what we're actually doing, who's managing it, and where we are within that process.
That's brilliant, because one of the reasons I say that around keeping evidence is, that's a reasonable adjustment, and you're also being able to help and support that employee. So when I go back to the example of stalking, if they say, gosh, they've been outside the office again, or they've actually got a non-molestation order, which means they can't come within a certain amount of space where they work, actually the company have a bit of responsibility then to be able to log that, to be able to help with the police records, or they can ask that person to leave. So that's it's building it into all of that area of risk. So that's brilliant to hear that you do keep that kind of thing in place.
Elaine's saying that they have a customer caution register, but could include perpetrators.
Does it do it at the moment? Include them?
Yes.
Yeah, it does.
Well, she's saying could include perpetrators, so I'm not quite sure whether they do already, Elaine.
Okay, but again, that's
at the moment it wouldn't do because of probably who has access to that. But we would I suppose initially treat domestic abuse case as a safeguarding case, so we have processing in place for that, so there would be records and a register through that process, through the safeguarding process.
Yeah, and that's a really good point around the safeguarding, because again, it depends on the environment that you work in. So some of my clients are work within care homes, so actually as soon as we start talking about any of this, they've already got a lot of systems in place. If you work in education, again, you have a lot of systems in place around safeguarding. Like I say, some people's it might actually hit the health and safety risk register rather than the HR one, potentially. But does anybody talk about domestic abuse in their companies at the moment at all? Is it something that's discussed?
We do quite a lot, but I'm local authority, so that's because we do have responsibilities in terms of our customers, and we actually have a dedicated domestic abuse officer. But we do also, beyond that, we do also have a staff domestic abuse policy, and all staff have to do like an online training module, but that's more from the point of view of customers.
Okay, but that's a fantastic start, because that's one of the things that if you have the capacity to have a particular headcount for somebody who is trained now. And I want to make this point, is that in HR, we are not trained to be, the expert in everything. We cannot be. We can get support networks around us. We can get internal or external specialisms if we need to. But I don't want people to feel that the pressure is on them to suddenly become an expert in this conversation. I just want us to be able to consider how some of the practices that we have put in place already can start bringing this conversation in. But public sector is an industry or a market that actually, yes, this has probably been discussed much more widely than some of the private sector. One of the big companies that seems to sort of been a beacon is Vodafone. So Vodafone did some research back in 2019 around workplaces in general, and they introduced a policy that they now pay 10 days paid leave to support any of their employees that are experiencing domestic abuse. And the reason that's really important is that actually when you're going through periods of change, knowing that you've got a job that is supportive in the first place, knowing you can take time off and be paid for it, and knowing that that environment you can go to say this is what's happening, is incredibly important actually. So they've been quite pioneering in changing sort of some of the terminology around things. And I suppose that comes around the culture really, because this is a cultural change. So again, with many things that we talk about in HR, we have to drip feed. So it doesn't suddenly change overnight, but if you've got the responsibility or influence over the training budgets or the costs, actually, as you're doing that over the next sort of couple of months ready for April, is there an opportunity for you to say, we would like to start looking at some awareness programs, or we would like somebody to be trained in the same way as you may have a mental health first aider? Actually, have we got the ability, or could we highlight this as training in the future that we would like to invest in our business? And I suppose the next thing I just wanted to ask was around budgets. Are you responsible for your wellbeing budgets at all? And what goes on the agenda?
Feedback's from yes in the chat group.
Yeah, so that's brilliant as well, because I would say that if you are responsible for that, there may be policies or there may be support channels you've already got in place that if you delve down into the detail, they may cover some of this information already. So you won't need to be reworking the wheel, but you might be able to go to them and get some information. It depends what you already have in place. Has anybody explored any of that under their sort of EAP or this kind of support that is given? No, and that's okay, that's fine.
Sorry, yes. Sorry, Alice. Caroline and Wendy have said yes if they're happy to share.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've got an EU company, so it's not just within the UK, mine is within Europe, so France, Belgium, Germany. So we have an organisation that we work with, which is like counselling, but also not only in those areas, but also does sort of coaching as well, which is unlike potentially sort of the EAP programs, which I know tend to do about 6 sessions because it's only a short service, whereas this is a trained psychiatrist. So if it does need to go to somebody else, they can then do offshoot referrals along with that. But I had to do that because it needed to be an organisation that would cover all my staff wherever they were.
Okay, and again, that's a really good point, because every company is going to be different. So I'm not going to sit here and say, and here is a lovely policy for you to take forward, because every situation in each company is going to have slightly different needs. So that's really good to hear that you've been able to sort of put that investment into place, Caroline, and across, like you say, multiple countries as well.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad as well, because I think the price that I paid for that, it was £25 per head per employee, but it is unlimited. So it didn't even need to have, you get a certain amount. So for me, it's possible, yes, it's slightly more expensive, but it's also, it doesn't matter because mine are European. It's £25 sterling or it's £25 EU euros. So
that is reasonable. And often under private healthcare insurances as well, if you start looking at the add-ons or the detail, sometimes you can actually, like you say, get specific counselling or support through those as well. So no, that's really encouraging to hear. Okay, I won't labour on too much more around the law and the legislations, but it is important, as we write our policies and we check them every year, often you'll find that we relate and we talk about legislations. And so when something changes, like the Domestic Abuse Act did, the likelihood is, unless you have a employment law firm that are really on the ball with this particular topic, it won't have filtered down yet into the everyday kind of policy changes you need to make. Right, so again, I'm going to thank you for contributions so far. So I'm just going to ask for a bit more, really. Before we sort of start delving into the detail of the actual framework, I wanted to ask you really about your data. How do you monitor data at the moment? So I mean that in terms of performance or absences, I'll say that. How do you monitor that at the moment? I can't
Our
see
absence, I was going to say, our absence recording really just goes on our payroll system. I mean, obviously I'm a tiny company, so on our payroll system, it enables us to be able to put in whether somebody's in or not.
Yeah.
Other people are saying they hate to admit it, they don't have a system. They have 4 different systems.
Spreadsheet.
HR and payroll system, so it's the same as me. Elaine says DA. Is DA the system? Elaine, sorry, I'm not familiar.
Oh, sorry, no, we don't have any way of capturing or reporting on things like domestic abuse or that. Sorry, I mean domestic abuse by DA.
And so that's, again, when we talked about the data and the GDPR at the beginning, that's sort of the questions around it. So you're right. If we have a fancy spreadsheet, brilliant. If we have a database that gives you drop downs of different reasons, because, you know, when we look at absence, what kind of sickness levels, what kind of things, because again, that influences potentially how we look at private healthcare, you know, it influences what we do. So do we just put absence, other? Do we capture the information about why someone's away? Have we seen a repeated pattern of somebody coming in late? Have we seen them repeatedly taking time off at odd times? Have we noticed anything that's unusual in people's behaviour? Because often, if it's a large team, you may not see that from your HR point of view, but the smaller team might notice those particular differences. Again, some people record people coming in late, some people don't. Again, for me, going back to your data and looking at the behaviour changes of people is a really good indicator of lots and lots of things. Again, when we talk about performance, often, you know, that's it, when it comes to a head about someone's performance, we've seen it coming. We've seen the patterns. We've seen, you know, the repeat of whatever it is that's going on. So that would be my first point, really, is actually possibly not having systems could be a benefit, because you can create different categories around that. So I just want to say that from a point of view is that when you're thinking about building in a policy or talking about different cultural change, just think about how you might want to capture the data in a confidential way that isn't necessary for you to be able to provide stats of how wonderful we've been in helping these people, but maybe to provide that evidence as well for that employee. So that's good that you've got some element of it. The CIPD.
Alice, people are just popping in the chat box that actually they rely a lot on managers to understand what to look out for, because they're obviously slightly removed, and saying it's down to those managers having those conversations, and unless you're in Belgium, where you're legally not allowed to ask any reasons for being off sick.
No. Okay.
And, you know, from my perspective, I wonder how many times, and you know, if somebody, how many times somebody would say, actually,
they won't.
I was going to say, I wouldn't have thought they would.
No, they won't.
Down to people to notice.
So it's the indicators. So we'll go on and I'll talk a little bit about that. But so an example will be somebody turning up late, and the reason they're late is their partner may not have allowed them to use the car, a car that they were just about to get into to go to work, and then they've got to find alternative ways of getting to work. Then if that element of control is in place to prevent that person or to have an impact on that person, the likelihood is they're going to come in and go, I'm really sorry the car didn't start, or oh, the traffic was terrible. They're not going to tell you the bit behind it. They might do if they've already disclosed to you and it's a conversation, then they might start opening up and saying more information. But you're absolutely right, with every life event, you know, it's the same as somebody's going through a particularly difficult period of their own lives. Often they don't recognise or may not say about it until we're much further down the line, or actually in the situation or the example I just gave, they may not see that as control. They just might see their partner as being a little bit difficult that morning. So it's again picking up on what all those indicators are potentially. So I was going to say that the CIPD did a little bit of research. So the first time I actually did a presentation on this topic was the end of 2020. before the bill had been passed. And it's interesting looking back at those sort of original slides, really, because the research hasn't really moved on that much, a little bit, but not that much. So CIPD, I've linked all of this at the end so you can find it, but the CIPD did a survey, and they said that only 24% of employees were aware of a domestic abuse policy. So that's obviously was it Elaine who worked in the public sector, that actually, you know, your environment might talk about this a bit more. It doesn't mean that 100% of your employers are aware that it's there. Only, you know, CIPD are finding under that survey that only, you know, a quarter of them were aware that that policy even existed. Again, that's fine because it possibly hasn't met their radar. But when we go back to saying that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men are impacted, it's how do we get those messages and those support channels out to those people in understanding that's there for them when they need it. Elaine, do you have much sort of like feedback from any of the policies at all that are in place?
No, other than sort of would bounce them around sort of safeguarding officers, people that work in housing, things like that, because they might have more experience of handling domestic abuse cases. But no, from the very limited number of domestic abuse cases that we have been aware of, we haven't been given feedback. Okay, so that's interesting then, isn't it? I mean, like you said, it's more customer facing, but we're all internal customers as well, aren't we? And actually, yeah, it's interesting really that, and again, I think that comes back to stigma and taboo and people just not wanting to talk about it. So yeah, so actually having the framework and the policy in the first place may not be there, and if it is there, the awareness of it is quite low, is what they're finding, which is why when I go back to one of the main principles of the new Act is to raise awareness. That's where I feel that we have a part to play in that, in the education piece. What I actually am doing through the trust at the moment, for the charity, is I'm doing something called Dragon's Apprentice. I don't know if it is in your area at all, but in Dacorum where I am, year 11 students given £100 seed money to change it to £1,000 over a 6-month period, and I'm, as a trustee, working with them, and that is really important because I'm raising awareness at a very, you know, 17-year-old age, and actually the stats start from the age of 16 right the way up into sort of the 70s. And the reason why that's so long is that actually relationships start 16-year-olds. Domestic abuse can happen at that point, but children are protected under the Act now, but actually those young adults need education and awareness building from much earlier on, and within the educational side. And then we have the flip side, which again, if you work in a caring environment, domestic abuse in the elderly is on the increase and being reported much more. And that's when we talk about right at the beginning when I talked about it needs a personal relationship, that can be family members and family members. So the safeguarding side comes in at that point. But again, all of these stats are quite difficult at the moment to be able to track because it's ever changing at the moment. Anyway, what I want to just ask really here is, under the HR influence, what policies and processes and practices, or 3 Ps, would you have in place already? What kind of policies do you kind of operate with? The standard, or do you have anything specific? I'm talking around policies like bullying, harassment, or anything like that. What policies do you already have? Is anything coming up in the chat at all?
Not in the chat, no. I mean,
that's
we
fine.
have, oh, here we go. Sorry. Karen says we're going through a review at present, so they have a general bullying, harassment code of conduct, and that's what I was going to say. That's what we have. We have a kind of code of conduct. Caroline said they're also implementing an employee charter. Okay. And actually, that's a that's probably what we have. We have an employee charter of how I expect people to behave within the work environment, and then we have a bullying policy, but probably nothing much more than that.
Okay.
Except for your standard kind of
the standard policies that link into contracts basically is what, and that again is, depending on the size of your business, is absolutely fine and sufficient. I suppose for me it's around thinking around slightly wider, so your IT policies or your data protection. Again, I go back to thinking around the fact that we've got hybrid working. So when people used to go to work, they, you know, it's quite difficult potentially to, in some companies, to even look at, you know, you can't do your Sainsbury's shopping your lunch break because everything turns to snow. But actually, when you're working from home, your IT equipment is much more open to abuse, or can be seen more, or the information. So actually looking at how your IT is put together can help. And again, I know some companies have filters on their email system, so it doesn't, if an abusive email comes through, it wouldn't actually, it would be stopped in the system. And now the reason I mention things like that is because, again, Vodafone did the part of their research, and they said about 80% of people received abuse through emails and phone calls within the workplace. So even though they went to work, that continuation happens. So it's, again, being mindful or thinking around how can we kind of put these boundaries in place, how can we protect? And it goes back to that duty of care kind of statement, which is wider than maybe just a bullying or harassment policy, or, you know, the code of conduct. Things about lone working. Does anybody have any lone workers? Yes. So do you have check-ins or code words, or how do you manage lone workers?
Yeah, we have systems in place, so we know where somebody is going to be if they're going out to see clients or out on meetings or meet candidates. And when people were in the office, we would have code words that people would use. So if they were, say, on reception, and they felt uncomfortable when somebody came in, they would ring upstairs and use one of the code words. Yeah.
So these are all the same techniques that you can take in. So when you talk around, if somebody comes and discloses something to you, you've already got quite a lot of tools and practices in place already. So it's getting those and putting those into a plan for that particular person. So if they come in and they need to use a code word because on the phone is their partner or whatever, actually these are the things which, I'm not saying completely rework the wheel, just reinvent it. Just take in some of the practice you've got already and be mindful in how you could support somebody who's experienced domestic abuse. So that, again, they're really good things in place. I've talked about annual leave, and I've said examples around the likes of Vodafone having paid leave. Again, depending on the size of your company, it could be statutory leave that's being offered. You could have other types of leave that are in place already, compassionate, jury service, etc. Depends on the environment. I appreciate there's a cost to the business to putting in paid leave, but this isn't going to be utilised by everybody. But again, it's there that person has the reassurance that if they need to take time off for court proceedings, or they need to take time off to support children, or whatever it may be, that they're not going to be a financial impact for that. And I know that we talked about financial wellbeing in a previous session. Some of the stats came out today to say that 16% of adults have experienced economic abuse, or the financial abuse. So 16% of adults, the likelihood they're the same people that are going to need financial wellbeing support within your workplaces. And again, are they going to come and tell you that the reason they're having problems with their money is because the income they have is restricted? They only are allowed £200 a month. They're only allowed. No, it's not something that they potentially would offer straight away. So again, when you talk about maybe getting specialist support or trained support, it's again being able to get those indicators that there might be something else going on. Is there anything anybody wants to sort of say around their policies or awareness at this point at all?
Caroline was just saying that the HR system that she's trying to get in place has an area on it which allows somebody to anonymously raise an issue.
Yes.
Which she's hoping that will certainly help.
That's a really, really good system. The reason I said about ESG at the beginning is that it's a platform, it's a technology that I'm a HR advisor on for exactly that kind of thing. So whistleblowing and reporting. So it's reporting, so from a compliance point of view, but this would also fall into that. So you can bespoke those types of things. So that's really good from a safeguarding or a duty of care or raising a concern. They're brilliant systems to get into place. I'm conscious of time, so I will do is go on just briefly then, and I won't go into too much detail. The detail is in the slides, so and they will be shared. But when we talk about the domestic abuse framework, and we've talked a little bit about policies already and how you might put things into practice, but there are three things, really, three areas. And it's the same as you may approach another wellbeing conversation. Recognise, acknowledge and believe. And I think one of the things I would say is that if somebody approaches you with something, as a victim, hearing somebody saying, I recognise and I acknowledge what you're saying, I may not be able to know how to deal with it right now, but I believe you and I'm going to support you, is an incredible step. It takes, and again, the slides will say, it takes multiple times for somebody to try and leave a relationship, and it takes multiple times for somebody to actually go and seek the support in the first place. So if you are the person they've come to, actually how you respond or how your managers respond to that is really important. And I know we talked again about how managers are the front line of this. That's where your training really could be focused, is on the manager's awareness. So again, there are multiple agencies now that are offering training. I have got some contacts, if you wanted them, who can come in and do management training specifically on domestic abuse. So like I say, then the same as other wellbeing conversations, really, how you respond and support. So if you say, oh my God, I don't know what to do about it, that's perfectly okay. As long as you say, but don't worry, I'll find somebody who can support. You know, actually how you respond and how you take that forward is really important. And the third area is refer and reflect. So again, when we talk about getting the right support channels in place, it's really good that you've got a different approach to employee assistance program, but actually bringing this up at board level, talking about it from a holistic wellbeing point of view, and saying how are we going to be able to bring this into our wellbeing policies, and continuously talk around this subject, really. It often helps if you've got somebody in the senior team who can champion you. That I have seen over and over again, where you've had CEOs standing up and championing it, or having, if you've got an intranet or some kind of sharing platform where people share their stories, that has a huge impact on other people then coming forward. What I will just do is flick through the slides and then just leave some time for questions. These are the slides that I was just going to go in a bit more detail, but you can look at them in your own time. So these are the indicators around how people's working patterns are, the things that you can do, how you can pick up, so different working behaviours, that sort of thing all falls into here. Again, the responding, how you respond, who you seek, how you get the support. So the domestic abuse helpline, that, like I said, is the charity I support. The point of that is it's just a number. So if you don't know what to do, you can call that number as an employer. You can also get the likes of those charities to come in and talk to you and to give information and to leave information behind. So it's looking at the support channels of those people that are qualified in talking around domestic abuse. And there are multiple agencies that can do that. And the last thing is around, like I said, the responding and support. And we've talked about some of it in the conversation about risk registers, keeping facts and notes, ultimately creating a safe space for people to come and speak to you. And actually, I really feel having the influence of trying to get onto the training budget, some money to be able to get your managers trained, or to get at least one person trained internally in understanding, and they can be the person that you can refer things to, or you can ask for support from. Have you got, I know that was a bit rushed at the end, but have you got any questions on that framework at all? I'll get back to it.
I don't, Alice, but there is in the chat box. Should a business have a plan for how to deal with domestic abuse, like they would do for mental health?
Yes, yeah, I think there should be a plan, because like I say, I can refer back to myself. 12 years is a really long time, and actually I was employed in multiple places. So if I came for interview, it's not a protected characteristic, but at some point in the future I would really like to see this being protected, that you're not when you turn up to an interview and you say, I need these adjustments in place because of my mental health, or I need these adjustments in place because of my disability, I need these adjustments in place because this is stuff I have to deal with. And actually yes, there should be, in answer to that question, yes, there should be, because it's not a one point in time. I feel that it's a continuous support that's required.
Great, thank you. Has anybody else got any questions that they want to ask, or anything that we haven't covered that you particularly wanted Alice to cover?
I can stop sharing if you like, and we can there we go. Are there any general questions at all?
Doesn't look like there is, Alice.
No,
I think the other one is when to contact.
I mean, from the point of, if you're going and you're speaking to somebody, you've got your boundaries of the duty of care. You might have whoever they might nominate as an next of kin might not be the person that they want to go and speak to.
Yeah.
Or it's kind of when you should go into that, because you potentially, coming from a place of good intentions, might actually make that situation 10 times worse.
Are you talking about in contacting next of kin?
Either next of kin, or if you're going to do like a referral, because you could go duty of care, or he's not coming in, when do I go and speak to this police person, or whatever else you might need to do, because you've got the bit of the GDPR combined with that person's right to privacy.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the things I would say is that I'm a big fan of having people talking about wellbeing plans. So when that person discloses to you, maybe if you just have a check-in point with them, so you just have that as a continuation of a check-in point. So if that person doesn't turn up to that particular meeting, whatever it is, maybe you have that agreement beforehand. If you don't turn up to that meeting, what next steps would you like me to do? Who would you like me to contact? So there could be somebody that they've already trusted in speaking to, could be their sister, for example, or a friend. They may be the point of contact that they have nominated rather than their partner or something else. So yes, it's managing that risk element. But this is where I say that for us in HR, we cannot be expected to be DA experts. This is when actually, if in doubt, that's when you seek support from a helpline or an expert, or if you've got somebody trained within, and that's when you make maybe that calculated risk. The same as if somebody doesn't turn up for work, like you say, if you're going to contact their next of kin, at what point do you do that? You've just got to take into account all of those other factors. But I really feel that's a conversation you could have with them up front and say, who would you like me to contact if you do not turn up at work, or if we have a major concern. And they could nominate their solicitor, for example. It could be multiple different people. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's not one size is going to fit all, unfortunately.
No, it does, but thank you.
Okay. Were any other questions at all? I don't know.
Hold on a second. Sorry, my chat box is quite small. Let me make the chat box bigger so I can see things. Oh no, I think that was Elaine just saying she needed to go.
And yeah, I did see coming up, the slides and everything will be shared, yes. And I didn't show you, but at the end I have linked into, if like me, I like to do the research, I've linked into some research papers, and I've talked about the different contacts, and Ida, for example, I think if you've got an interest, I think that's a really good starting place. Yeah.
Alice,
Okay.
thank you. Yeah, it was brilliant. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all your knowledge today. It was a really interesting topic. So thank you on behalf of everybody. I just want to double check whether there was another. Oh, sorry, I'm being absolutely rubbish on the chat box. Yes, just confirmation that Ida is a great resource, somebody was sharing. So I will share the presentation and the slides and any additional information from Alice early next week once we've edited the presentation. So yeah, thank you so much, Alice. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I will see you all again very soon.